What we need is something like what Jesus was saying on a massive scale, that if you actually followed Jesus, you would live a more simple lifestyle and eat vegetarian and all of these other things and give to the poor. You wouldn't be greedy. All of these other things would save the planet. I think Thich Nhat Hanh had a saying that it says, individual awakening is not enough. We need a collective awakening. So that's what I think we need, is some sort of collective awakening, like the highest teachings of Christianity, and also like the highest teachings of Buddhism and other religions as well. That all these religions are sort of converging on the need for our behavior to align more with what Christians would say is God's purpose.
Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Forum. I'm so glad you're here. I want to give a shout out to some of my more recent donors. I want to say thank you to Robin and to Chris and to Terry. Thank you so much for contributing to the podcast. It is the way we keep our voice of hope, inspiration, and awakening out in the world and touching the hearts and the lives of people all over the world. I appreciate your listening. I'd love for you to be a part of my YouTube community. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating and a review there. That always helps us keep going as well. But thank you for all that you do. And thank you for putting everything that we talk about here on this podcast, at least trying to put it into your life and taking it as a serious way to live the spiritual life. I'm really excited about my guest today. He's a former computer consultant. His name is Keith Akers, and he's a writer and a speaker and an activist. And he's written 4 books, including 2 books on early Christianity. They are called The Lost Religion of Jesus, which was published in the year 2000, and Disciples, which was published in the year 2013. And most recently, he was interviewed for the documentary Christspiracy, where he shared about Jesus's little-known opposition to animal sacrifice. In his former life as a computer consultant, he worked on projects with the United States Department of State and Education, American Management Systems, Bell Atlantic 9X Mobile, which is now Verizon, and others. But we're going to be talking to him today mostly about him being on Christspiracy and also about these forgotten teachings of Jesus and about early Christianity. Welcome, Keith.
It's great to be here. I'm glad to talk to you about this. All these subjects, they're very interesting to me, and I'm always excited when somebody else is interested in them also.
Yeah, I mean, I was sharing with you before we started that your book is really, I think, your books are really something new and really, really well researched. And it's fascinating to put yourself in a paradigm that's so different than what we've been taught about early Christianity. And so you've really done some work that's highly pioneering and also controversial. I think we'll get into the movie Christspiracy. But before we do all of that, can you share a little bit about how you went from being a computer consultant to this amazing researcher of early Christianity?
Well, they overlap to a certain extent, because I actually, while I was still working as a computer programmer, I was doing research on on early Christianity, and I remember that they would send me. I live in Denver, and they would send me off to New York on a plane every other week, so I had to travel to New York all the time. And so on the plane, I would get out, my copy of Epiphanius or the recognitions and homilies or whatever I was working on, and go through that. So I actually did a lot of my research while I was still working. But then when I retired, I published the book.
Gotta stay hydrated. I've got mine too.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yep.
It's like, no worries.
Okay, so so I guess my journey actually began when I was a student in philosophy. I majored in philosophy in college, and I think one of the reasons that I did it is because I wanted to come up with a philosophy of life. You know that people sometimes go into psychology because they want to like solve their personal problems. Well, this was the case of I wanted to find a philosophy of life. I wasn't directly interested in religion at first, but I became interested in religion because I saw that the two obviously overlap. And also, there's the question of spirituality versus religion and things like that. But I actually did not become, I actually got my philosophy of life, quote unquote, while after I had left school, and I was just going to the library, and I found a book in the library called Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, and
Mm.
I read that, and I just read a couple of pages, and in chapter, I believe it was 2, the chapter on factory farming, I said, that's it, I can't do this anymore. Uh, and I became a vegetarian shortly thereafter. And a few years later, I became vegan, and then I started getting interested in taking this message, the message of vegetarianism, that is, out to the world. This was in the late 70s, early 80s. So at that time, there wasn't a lot of attention to, quote, veganism. And, they were all interested in vegetarianism. And then the vegans would sort of say, well, actually, we're vegans, but you don't want to turn people off with that. Um, uh, so so that's how I was first came into this, because I wanted to take this out into the world. I wanted to become an activist. I wanted to promote vegetarianism. So I got involved in the Vegetarian Society of DC, and I had this idea: I'm going to write a book. And then I went through all the different topics in vegetarianism, and one of the topics that I got into was Christianity. And so I said, well, I've read the Bible, so I should just breeze right through this. But then I found out about Jewish Christianity, and this was a book. I came across a book by Hans Joachim Scherps, who it was called Jewish Christianity: Factional Disputes in the Early Church, and it was very scholarly. But I could see that in his view, and he was neither a vegetarian nor a Christian, he was a Jewish scholar of religion. According to him, early Jewish Christianity was vegetarian. And so I started doing research based on that. And I finally wound up writing an entirely new book, The Lost Religion of Jesus, based on my research. So that's essentially how I got into it. I was interested in vegetarianism. I wanted to take the message out to the world, and there didn't seem to be any good books on Christianity and vegetarianism, or on vegetarianism at first, although there are plenty now. But so I decided to research it and write it.
Wow, that's really interesting. I think that I became vegetarian in like 1973. I didn't know anybody in who was a vegetarian. I did it all by myself. I was in high school, and I'm just not going to do this anymore. So I was not aware of any movements. I wasn't even aware of Peter Singer's book, but I wish I had become aware of all that earlier. But I love the idea that you kind of found your way through philosophy and learning about early Christianity. I think that the whole Christian message is often a roadblock to the whole meat eating versus veg living question. And it's so interesting to me that that is one of the big roadblocks, stumbling blocks that religious people believe that this is ordained by God, that meat eating is ordained by God, even though in Genesis 1:29, you can clearly God's intention, if you believe in the Bible, clearly God's intention at the beginning of creation was that we were to be in harmony with all the animals, and none of us were supposed to be eating
Yes.
each other. It's just so very, very clear right there. So that would be God's if you believe in the Bible and if you believe in the story, then that's God's intention. Everything else is a fallen state. But for some reason, Christianity looks at the fallen state and says, well, God said this is okay, and so I'm going to do whatever the heck I want to animals. And it's so interesting. I'm so glad that you came to this place of learning that early Christianity was different than we know. So let's talk about that a little bit. Tell us about early Christianity.
Well, early Christianity actually was very much concerned about vegetarianism and animal sacrifice. And we know this for a variety of reasons. But the key historical thing to be aware of is that there was a big dispute in the early church over this very topic, over vegetarianism and animals sacrificed, sacrifice of animals for various religious purposes. And the Jewish Christians, as I found out, were very much opposed to both. In fact, if anything, they were almost more opposed to animal sacrifice than meat eating. If I could make an analogy, it's sort of like vegetarianism would be, I don't want to eat animals. But then animal sacrifice would be, you must eat animals. You are not a good person unless you eat animals or at least sanction their killing. And this is what Jesus was upset about. And this goes all throughout the Jewish Christian literatures, that they reject the bloody animal sacrifices. And of course, they got into a big dispute with each other in the early church over this very topic. And you can read about this in the Bible, in the letters of Paul, because Paul says, at one
Yes.
point says, there are some who are weak in faith and some who are strong in their faith. The weak man, the weak in faith people only eat vegetables, but we, the strong, understand that you can eat anything. And then in another place, he says, eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience. I think he says that in First Corinthians. And, and so it looks like this is actually specifically saying that, that that you cannot reject meat eating out of hand. That you can't say that it's unethical or that it's wrong to kill animals for that reason. And that's traditional interpretation. There's more
Yeah,
to it
Paul.
than that.
Yeah, Paul must have really liked meat. Can you first talk about what Jewish Christians are? Because I don't want people to get stuck on what that term is. I think it's the early Christians who were Jewish, as opposed to Paul's Christians who were in other areas and didn't have a Jewish roots at all, the Gentiles. Is that correct?
Uh, yeah, roughly, yes. The Jewish Christianity is not the best term to use, but it's the one we're stuck with. The reason we're
Okay.
stuck with it is that the early Jewish Christians, or the people we call Jewish Christians, there's no single name by which we know them. The most common name is Ebionites. That's the one that's used most in the early literature. But there's Nazarenes, and there's actually several categories of Nazarenes who all different groups, which are probably just one group, in my opinion, that have Nazarene spelled in slightly different ways. You've got the New Testament spelling, which is Nazorean, roughly, I think, and there's different ways of
Yeah.
transcribing the Greek, so this isn't exact. But that does not mean resident of Nazareth. It means, well, what does it mean? And the early church writers were just as puzzled about this as we are today. And Jerome says that it probably comes from Isaiah. There's a passage in Isaiah just before the wolf will lie down with the lamb passage in Isaiah 11, where he says, a branch shall spring from the root of Jesse. And the word branch in ancient Hebrew is spelled Nezer, Nazer. I don't know how you would pronounce it, but it's something like that. And so it was derived from that. Other people have other ideas, and we don't know exactly. But one thing we do know is that it does not mean resident of Nazareth. And
That's
so
so
this
interesting.
is like this is the issue that, and it's just so long as you don't know about Jewish Christianity, this is just sort of like a minor blip on your historical research stream. Okay, so they didn't know how to spell. What's the big deal? Um, but I think there's something deeper here, because then you see Epiphanius talking about a group, a heretical Jewish Christian group, which spells its name in the same way. And it goes on from there. So that's a second name. And then there's also the Elkezaites, which are a third group, which nobody knows about, who may not be Jewish Christian at all. They may not be Christian. Uh, and scholars debate this, and I talk about this in my book, Disciples. But it's very interesting. They seem to be more followers of John the Baptist. They also sort of like Jesus, but they like John the Baptist also. And today, they're still in existence. I believe it's in Iran somewhere, a group of the Mandaeans who are actually followers of John the Baptist who do not accept Jesus. So you've got all these little groups that have slightly different beliefs going through history. Now, the thing about early Jewish Christianity, this is a bad name, and because people bring expectations to when you say Jewish Christian, they want to know, oh, who are these Jewish Christians? It's not Jews for Jesus at all.
Okay.
This is a Jews for Jesus is a modern group. This is uh, uh, basically it's Jews who have converted to fundamentalist Christianity. Is the way I would put it. But they don't have anything in common with the early Jewish Christians that I'm aware of. There might be some group of modern Jewish Christians that are like this. So these are the people, early followers of Jesus, who, like Jesus, also considered themselves to be Jews. The important thing to remember, though, is that they had their own idea of what the Jewish law was, and they had their own idea of who Jesus was. So they followed the Jewish law as interpreted by Jesus.
Okay.
That's how
Okay.
they would put it.
So this would be like James and Peter and others, but
Yes.
those would be the ones that we would know, and they had fights, disagreements, arguments with
Yes.
Paul, who never knew Jesus. So these are the ones that were closest to him when he was alive, and and the Nazarenes or Nazirs or all of the different ways that that word is spelled could be equated with the Ebionites or something like that, or the Ebionites were a part of that group. And they had certain beliefs, right? As a group.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it was, could you share what those early beliefs were that they focused on?
A lot of the beliefs that the early Jewish Christian Ebionites or Nazarenes had were broadly similar to what we know of Orthodox Christianity. They call themselves the poor. The term Ebionim means the poor in Hebrew. And so they thought of themselves as not just giving to the poor or being nice to the poor. They were the poor. They had given up everything, and they thought of themselves as in this way because of the passage, or because of the passage that's also described in Acts, where all the apostles came together and all the believers came together, and they had everything in common. There was
Yeah.
not a needy person among them. And that's in Acts 2 and in Acts 4 also, in case you didn't pick it up in Acts 2. There's also another passage in Acts 4, 32 through 35, I believe. Uh, and so that's the first thing. They were very much against wealth, and they thought that the wealthy controlled too much of what was going on in the world. Uh, they were also vegetarians. That's the most interesting part for us. They also didn't drink alcohol, and they thought of Jesus as the true prophet. So they never talk. They did talk about Jesus as being the Christ, but they also seemed to think that Jesus was the eternal Christ, and what the relationship between this Christ spirit, I guess we could call, and the person Jesus and all of us as disciples uh, is not entirely clear. But the way I would interpret it is that 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 they saw themselves as potentially being Christ-like or as being Christ. In fact, there's one passage in where Epiphanius says they think of themselves that if they follow the law, that they are themselves Christ's. And so there's sort of this idea, that Luther talks about the priesthood of the believer. Everyone should be their own priest. But in the early Jewish Christianity, it seems that everyone was that they were their own Christ, that they embodied Christ himself. And they had this idea that Jesus, Christ, whether this is Jesus or not, we can debate, but that Christ was reborn throughout history, and so he appears in various different epochs in different forms. So they had some sort of slightly deviant ideas about theology, but broadly speaking, they were like other Christians in many respects. The distinctive thing was their rejection of animal sacrifice and their embracing of vegetarianism.
And nonviolence, right? And
And nonviolence. They were
yeah,
pacifists.
they're pacifists. Yeah.
That's the third thing I meant to mention. That
That's
they
okay.
were,
I knew it was coming.
and yeah, that they, and this is one thing which they also held in common with other early Christians. All Christians before the Council of Nicaea were almost all were pacifists as a matter of course. It was just accepted. It didn't even have to be discussed. And all the early church fathers, when they talk about the passage where it says, "Oh, love your enemies and do not resist one who is evil," and all of those passages says, obviously, this is what we have to do. We can't be violent. We can't participate in war. So they were
Yeah, and
also
all of it. I
pacifists.
mean, the pacifism and the anti-animal sacrifice and the vegetarianism, all of that is pacifism.
Yes. Yes.
All of that is it's all an expression of being non-violent. So it's not just being non-violent against your human brother or sister, but also we're not going to be violent towards the rest of God's creatures.
Yes.
Um, yeah, so I can already hear people who are gospel readers hear the saying, but what if, what if, what if, what if? And I've had guests on my podcast where we go through each one of those. But I want to generally talk about the writings that you're talking about are different than some of the gospel writings. And people will say, well, Jesus multiplied the fish and Jesus helped the fishermen and Jesus sent demons into pigs and they went off the cliff and Jesus, had fish, the resurrected Jesus. You know them all. We all know them
Yes.
all.
Yes. Yes.
So, personally, when you look at the Bible, I see the Bible as this conflict between meat-eating writers and the pacifist writers. And so the meat-eating writers are writing this, and then the prophets are trying to correct it and saying, no, that God does not want this. God wants peace. And so you see that all the time in the Old Testament. So can you just kind of share a little bit about, A, what are the writings you're looking at that these people might have given you this idea about these people? And then B, why do the Gospels kind of conflict with that some?
Yes. One thing that we have to understand is that the Bible does not take a consistent stand on vegetarianism. You can find pro and anti passages all throughout. For every, you've got Genesis 1:29. We're all supposed to be vegan, but then we can have the animal sacrifices, and you're supposed to sacrifice animals, and it goes on all like that all throughout
God
the.
changes. God changes
Yeah,
his mind a
yeah,
lot.
yeah, I can't
In the
seem
Old
to make up
Testament.
his mind. So, so
Are you a killer or are you not?
yeah. So I'm not a biblical literalist at all, and I think the early Jewish Christians also, interestingly, were not biblical literalists. They also had a very sort of surprisingly modern criticism of the Old Testament. They said that a lot of people put things in the Old Testament that God never intended, God didn't say. And you can even find some of this in the Old Testament itself. For example, in Jeremiah, he says, go ahead and make animal sacrifices if you want. But when I brought you out of Egypt, I gave you no commands about animal sacrifices. I said not a word about them. And then you've got Isaiah saying, what to me are all your multitude of sacrifices? I've had enough of the blood of animals. Wash your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves and be clean. So you've got pro and con all throughout. Now the fish stories. Ah, yes, the fish stories in the New Testament, and I can talk a lot about them, but I will mention that you see the fish stories sort of being modified even as the Bible is written. For example, take the passage where the most famous, the most problematic fish stories, which I discussed on my blogs about a year ago, is the one about the calling, which is known to us, I think, mostly as the calling of the 12, where
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Jesus goes out and says, and they're Peter and who all else is there? Peter and Andrew, I think,
Yeah, I
are
think
out there fishing, and he says, uh, "Go and follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And so they leave their nets behind and they follow Jesus. But you look at how this passage is slowly modified so that in Luke now suddenly he's saying cast your nets on no in John he's saying cast your nets on the other side,
yeah.
and then they bring up this huge haul of fish and everybody's happy, well, except for the fish, I presume. But but
Bad day for them.
yeah, but so this story has become modified over time, even in the Gospels that we have. You can see that there's different versions of them. Uh, Now the story about the where Jesus eats fish after the resurrection, that's almost certainly not historical, because the reason Jesus eats fish in that case, he says, is because they didn't think that Jesus was really there. That there, in ancient times, there was this idea that a ghost or a spirit could not eat anything because they were like ghosts. It's like the the joke about there's this joke about a skeleton walks into a bar. He says, "Give me a beer and a mop." Okay, so that you can't. So that idea that if you were a ghost or a spirit, you couldn't eat anything, and so that's why Jesus says, "Well, give me something to eat. Do you have anything to eat? And I'll eat it right here before you."
Yeah,
And so
to
they give
prove
him a
that.
fish, and there it goes. Well, this is a view or a controversy which didn't even exist in the first century. It was only in the second century with the Gnostics, the Gnostics such as Marcion and Valentinus, who actually did believe that Jesus never really incarnated in the body, either on earth or anywhere else. That he was a ghost or a spirit, that he was sent from another world into our world, and that if we follow him or do what he wants, that this other God, not the God of the Jews, but another God, a higher, true spiritual God, will save us in eternity. So there's all these weird kinds of beliefs that
Yeah.
invade Christianity, and that's what's being addressed. Is that this view did not exist in the first century? It's only in the second century and even later that you have this controversy. So that's almost certainly added later.
Interesting. That's really, really interesting. So there's early on, there's just lots of different ideas. And then Paul comes along and somehow he ends up being successful. He's kind of like the marketing guy or
Yeah.
he
Yes.
incorporates what works and what you can market to people and creates a religion that will take off, because I could see that Paul would go, "Well, people don't want to live a simple life. They all want to live, a more extravagant life, and people don't want to give up their animal flesh. They can't tell them that. And people don't want to be circumcised. I can't tell them that. So if I want to get this religion going, and I don't know if I don't know the heart of Paul, so I can't say if he had good intentions or bad intentions, but I can see that he felt he needed to create something that could catch on. So,
Yes. Yes.
yeah. And so
No.
that's why they were the early Jewish Christians, and Paul had some conflicts and trying to establish who Jesus really was. And Paul, who had never met him, is saying, "This is what I know, and I'm going to go off and tell everybody this." And so that I could see that could have been so frustrating for, for James and Peter and those guys.
Yes. Yeah. My views of Paul have somewhat moderated over the years. I think that Paul was did not believe in insisting on vegetarianism, but I think that what he was about spreading the message, as you suggested, that he felt that the world was coming to an end. That he and some other early Christians also thought that the world is coming to an end soon, like maybe not next year, but in 5 years or something like that. And that we were all going to be swept up. We were going to have the rapture or something like that. We were all going to go up into heaven. Uh, and so it was important to save as many people as possible. We don't have time for conflicts over food. Let's just get on with it and save all these souls. So I think that's sort of where he was coming from. He also wanted to spread his ideas into the upper class. And in ancient times, the only people who would go into the meat market and buy something would be the rich. That in
Oh,
ancient
yeah.
times, almost everyone was a vegan almost all the time just because they couldn't afford it. So you were typically on a very not probably not nutritionally adequate diet. Everybody ate this way. And it was only on special occasions, very special occasions, usually religious ones, that you would eat meat. And that's another reason why Jesus almost appears to be more against animal sacrifice, or the Jewish Christian Jesus seems to be more against animal sacrifice than against meat eating, because most people weren't tempted to eat meat except on festival days. Either
Okay.
if you're a pagan, killing a bull and sacrificing to Zeus, or at the Jewish Passover or something like that.
Yeah, we forget that people aren't eating bacon and eggs in the morning and turkey sandwich in the afternoon and
Mm.
roast beef at night like people do today. A very, very, very different world.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
So
I think we need to not lose the central point that points to Jesus being against animal sacrifice, and that's the temple.
yes, yes.
Yes.
The-
So let's talk a
the-
little bit about that because people think that that was the money changers and it was all about the bankers. But when you really look at it, when you really look at the words and the phrases that are there in the scriptures, it's very clear what happened there. So why don't I let you tell that?
Yes, if you the incident in the temple is one of the few stories about Jesus that's in all four gospels. And in none of them are the money changers at the top of the list. In fact, in Luke, they're not even mentioned at all. It's those who are selling and buying in the temple. And what are they selling and buying? They're selling and buying animals to be sacrificed. The ancient temple was more like a butcher's shop or slaughterhouse than a modern place of worship. Today, when we say the word temple, you think of, oh, we're going to go in someplace and maybe sing a few hymns, and somebody's going to get up and give a little homily on how we should be good. But this was where animals were brought to be sacrificed, and it was a big business. In Josephus, you see numerous accounts of how animals without number would be slaughtered around the Jewish festivals. And even the archaeologists now have gone in and they've looked at some of the bones that were around the temple that date to the time of the temple sacrifices. And there were animals being brought in from all over the area. I don't know how they figured this out. It's
Yeah.
through through DNA analysis or something like that. But they discovered that these bones were coming from all over the area. The local economy was not enough to supply all the animals that were needed, and so animal sacrifice was indeed also a business opportunity for a lot of people, and so that's what was going on in the temple. But then again, this is something that's also that Jesus wouldn't be interested in anyway, because he doesn't like the rich. He doesn't think we should be greedy, and he certainly doesn't like violence as well. So he's got a
But
number of reasons for being against the temple.
yeah, right. But it also says that he opened the cages and turned over the tables and freed some of the animals. So it wasn't
Yes,
like just throwing a fit about this business that's happening here and
yes,
you're exploiting people and all of
yes,
that. And
yes, yes,
although I think a good part of it is, the temple should be a house of prayer. It shouldn't be this
yes,
market. It shouldn't be this business. people need to have access to God the Father directly. They don't need all this stuff. This is an opposition of what I've come to tell people. And and if that was all it was, then that would have been all it was. But he freed the animals. He opened the
Yes.
cages. So there's something else, a statement there that's saying these animals should not be exploited, caged, and murdered in this way. And so I think that was, I mean, I think what happened there was such an offense to the power structures of the day,
Yes.
the
Absolutely.
religious authorities and the business, and it's like all you just think about all the big businesses that we have in our world today. This would have been like the biggest business, and to threaten that would have been like, we need to get rid of this guy. I mean, that's if he gets a following, or if he has his following, could really be dangerous to us. So I do want to talk a little bit about your thoughts on Jesus being a part of a movement that already exists. But I don't want to lose the idea of the temple sacrifice and really what the movie Christspiracy was pointing out in large part during the movie. So why don't we talk about that first? Because I think Christspiracy covered a lot of different areas, and they talked to people of interfaith, and they traveled, and they talked to Buddhist monks and all of that, but the focal point of this was the question, how would Jesus kill an animal? And when you think about that, can you even imagine that? And then I believe it was Cameron Waters who walked through the temple areas and started seeing that, oh my gosh, this is a slaughterhouse, and this is where the blood would have flown and all of that. So they really, really revealed to people, I think, viewers, that the temple was a place, a bloody business, rather than, what you
Absolutely.
say, a place of worship. So what else would you want to offer about Christspiracy, or your experience of being interviewed there, or what you think about the movie?
Well, the movie can't be all bad because I'm in it.
Of course not.
Yeah, and I think they did a pretty good job. I think they did a pretty good job with the scholars. I think I was glad to see James Tabor there, Andrew Lindsay, of course, uh,
He was
and
fabulous. Yeah.
and so forth. So they interviewed the right people. I think they imparted a certain element of drama about this is a conspiracy to cover up the the
Yeah.
early uh, the early history of the church. And yes, it is sort of a conspiracy, but it's hidden in plain sight because all you have to do is read the early literature, and there it is. Objections to animal sacrifice are all over the place. And the Jewish Christians were the people who were in the same tradition as Jesus. So how can you get around this? How can you get around this problem? Then no one sees any problem with identifying Gentile Christianity with early the James, Peter, and John, all the other disciples. But if you look at Jewish Christianity, somehow then people sort of have a problem with that, which I think is inconsistent. So I think
Yeah.
the movie did do a pretty good job of presenting the scholarly opinions, and I generally go along with that. There's a certain element of drama. There's even a chase scene. Uh, remember where they're going through the streets
I
and,
did.
and
I
trying
do.
to get to the
I do.
border, and
Yeah.
so
My
so
favorite parts were you and Andrew Lindsay.
well, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a certain bit of dramatization there, which sort of distracts from uh, the scholarly import. But still, I think they did a pretty good job.
Yeah. Yeah. It is, I think it could be eye-opening. I think that unless you can go through and refute every scripture that shows where Jesus ate meat, or Jesus supported meat eating, or whatever, I don't think it's going to turn the minds of Christians. I think that, Christians have their gospels that they believe is literal truth. And that's why I think it's so important for someone like you to say, oh, there's some mistranslations, or these things were added, and all of that through your scholarship.
Well, the thing about the Bible is that you can find almost anything there that you want, and that's something that even biblical scholars have pointed out. Says John Crossan says, you can paint almost any picture of Jesus you want. He's for temple worship. He's against temple worship. He's for Jesus claiming to be the Christ, or he's not for Jesus did not claim to be the Christ. And you go through all these things. He was for political revolt, or he was against political revolt.
Right, right,
And
right,
you pick your passage. You can do anything you want. The thing is, if you're what I often say is that if your heart is closed, it doesn't matter what the scriptures say. You could find a scripture that says, and Jesus said, verily go vegan for the planet, and still they wouldn't believe. They would find an excuse not to. And you see this
right,
with many Buddhists, because many Buddhists, I
right.
mean, it's right there. First precept: do not take the life of any sentient creature. And then you say, "Oh, no problem." So even if we found biblical proof that Jesus was vegetarian, it probably wouldn't help. But if your heart is open, you don't really need scripture.
I completely agree. I've been thinking about this a lot as I was preparing for this podcast. I've been thinking about what if there was irrefutable proof that Jesus was against animal sacrifice, Jesus did not consume animals, and Jesus was, a pacifist and all of that. Irrefutable proof. Let's say we could all go back in a time machine and actually witness it ourselves. Would that change anyone's mind? And I thought, people would just make a new religion. They would
Yeah,
make a new religion that would support their
right.
own beliefs.
Yep.
And that's why I was thinking about the 10 commandments. And the first commandment is you shall have no other gods before me. And and what we find is things like wealth, money, meat. These things are gods. The material
Yes.
world. It's a god. And then okay, so we like that, and I'm not excluded from that. I'm part of this material world. I've got a nice dress to the wedding I'm going to in 3 weeks. I'm not going to go as a pauper. It's my daughter's wedding, so I live in the material world. But I think that what happens is we will create a religion that supports the God that we really worship. And if it's money, we're going to have a prosperity religion,
Yes.
and God supports prosperity and all of that. And nothing wrong with that, prosperity, but that's a religion we're going to choose. And if it's like, well, I'm not going to give up my meat, then I'm going to look at all of that and go, well, Jesus definitely ate meat. God ate meat. So therefore, all ate meat. I'll create that religion. And I just think it really points to when push comes to shove, where is our faith? Where is our belief really? What do we really worship? If we
Exactly.
had irrefutable truth of the things that you're saying about the early Christians and Jesus, would we change? Probably not.
Yes. Exactly.
And then I started thinking that's the religion we have today. That's what Paul did. He
Yeah.
created a religion that everybody could kind of keep their own beliefs around, but it also was convenient for the ultra rich, the real power, like the kings and all that. We could create a papacy. We could create control over people, and we could control them through fear. And so Paul's version of Christianity also helped, assuage what those people wanted for the peons in the world. So that's what we have now. And I like what you say that if we just listen to our hearts, if we just listen to our hearts and go, well, what, like they said in Christspiracy, how would Jesus kill an animal? What would the Christ do? That's the answer. What would the Christ, God and me, if you believe God created all and that all is good, then what would God do? What we do as God people? We would not be violent. We would not hurt each other. We would not harm each other. We would certainly not have businesses that kill animals.
Yes. Exactly. Exactly.
That's
And
my
so much more.
soapbox.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's That's my soapbox. It's so obvious. I remember having a conversation with somebody once, and I was asking about all these things about scripture. What about the scripture? And he responded to me like, "Do you think that the Son of God would really eat an animal? I mean, if he was the Son of God, of course not." That's the first time I ever heard that. It's like, oh, that's interesting.
Yes. Yes.
As long as, yeah. So anyway, all right. So before we we've got another 15 minutes or so. I think one of the interesting things in your book, The Disciples, is you you create a scenario where Jesus wasn't necessarily this amazing leader with all these new ideas and everybody flocking to all of these new ideas, but there was a movement afoot, and that he emerged as like the George Washington of that
Yes.
movement. And so he's credited with a lot of what the movement was saying, but that he was the most logical or the best, the most charismatic or whatever leader or speaker. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, to me, it's clear that all of the distinctive ideas of the Ebionites and of even early Christianity were already present at the time. There's been a lot of discussion about Jesus being a scene. I think that the scenes probably did influence early Christianity. I don't think Jesus was directly in a scene. In fact, I think that the scenes were sort of a reclusive group. And when Jesus talks about don't hide your lamp under a bushel, no one hides their lamp under a bushel. Says that's what he was. I think he was sort of directed at the Essenes. Says
Oh,
you've got the
interesting.
right idea. Now you need to take it out into the world. Uh,
Ah,
and he's baptized by John the Baptist. As all scholars will agree, and all the scriptures agree that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. And so originally, Jesus was one of John's followers. It was only after John the Baptist was executed, then Jesus sort of comes more into prominence and advocates a lot of the same ideas that John the Baptist was doing. For example, he's very concerned about people uh, putting aside their wives, shall we say, and this is what actually got John the Baptist killed. Is he objected that I think Herod or I think Herod,
yeah, it
I
was
may
Herod.
not have the story
It's
exactly,
Herod.
but Herod wants to just dumps his wife and runs off with somebody else, and John the Baptist doesn't like that,
He
and
calls
so
him out on it.
yeah,
He
yeah, and so Herod had him executed. Um, so then and I think you see that also in the New Testament where Jesus is very concerned about this kind of divorce because in ancient times divorce was mostly a man deciding that he didn't want to put up with his wife anymore. So he just says, "Well, run along now. I've got somebody else," and then of course the wife is destitute, uh, and so that's according to Jesus that's not a good thing. So you see, so there's a similarity also, and you see there and also in their general poverty that John lives very simply. Um, and Jesus also advocates simple living. And so I think that the key ideas of early Christianity were already there. They may not have been codified yet or set down in writing, but they were there. They were alive and in the air. And opposition to animal sacrifice, that goes back 1,000 years, almost as long as we've had animal sacrifices in ancient Judaism. You've also had people complaining about it, often very bitterly. You've got Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos and Ezekiel all making deprecatory comments about animal sacrifices. And these are not just comments that are saying, oh, because of your hypocrisy, I will not accept your sacrifices. It's objections to the practice itself. And I think Hosea, I think, says, I require mercy,
mercy. Yeah,
not sacrifice. And that's
that's
something
pretty
that
clear.
Jesus
Yeah.
himself quotes. So Jesus is quoting from the prophets. He's clearly uh, in consonance with the Old Testament prophets on this point. So I don't think that Jesus probably came up with something that was new, but is certainly a very brave figure. But he was not the originator of many of the characteristic ideas of early Christianity.
So do you think like love one another, love your neighbor, love your enemy, forgive? And what about the healing? Do you think that these were things that were going on at the time, or do you think that these are stories attributed to him? Based on your research, what do you think?
I've never really investigated the healing miracles in any depth. My sort of impression is that there is a history of healing somewhere, and people remembered that Jesus helped to heal people. But I don't know exactly how miraculous it was, whether he just laid on his hands and then suddenly he could see or something like that. But I think that there was a memory that he brought healing to people, and that these
Yeah.
eventually got written down as stories. And of course, the most miraculous stories are the ones that are going to get copied. We know that from Facebook today. The most outrageous thing you can say is probably the one that's going to get the most likes, and it's probably the same thing
That's an
in
interesting
ancient
way,
times.
interesting comparison. Yeah.
So that they said, "Oh, he was a great healer," and I remember the time where, and it goes on and on like that. So, but I think that
Okay.
he did. There was an element of healing in his ministry, but it may not have been reported with complete scientific accuracy.
I mean, when I think of Jesus, I think about the parables, and I think about the kind of the encouragement slash admonition for us to love everybody, love everybody, love everybody. And do you think that was? I guess it. I guess we're just splitting hairs here, but do you think that was like a unique teaching, or is that like a teaching that was there that he was spearheading?
I think that it was probably not absolutely unique, but I think there was a historian of early Christianity. I think his last name was Stark. I've forgotten what his. I think his first name starts with an R. I've forgotten it. But anyway, he says that one of the main reasons, or one key reason why Christianity spread, was because there were plagues that afflicted the Roman Empire at that time. Now, most people knew that plagues, they didn't understand the scientific mechanism, but they realized that it was spreading somehow among the population. So they would avoid people that were sick. But the Christians took care of them anyway. And many plague victims, plague is not 100% fatal. And a lot of times you could, maybe 50% of the time or something like that, you'll recover if you just get basic help, like just giving them water to drink or something like that. Just take it, just basic care. And some plague victims will recover. And this strengthened Christianity because if you've been healed by the Christians, you're going to be kindly disposed towards Christianity. And so it sort of increased like that. It says, hey, we're hanging out with these people. They take care of us.
Well, and the taking care would be part of the teaching that, we love
Yes.
we love our neighbors. We're not,
Yes.
and Jesus went right into according to the story, to where the leper colony and things like that, whereas
Yeah.
others were
Yeah.
all these rules about the untouchables and all of that. And so,
Yes.
I mean, I think that's the most beautiful thing about Christianity, the idea, whether it's fully translates into our lives or not. The idea to love one another, which I think includes all beings, and
Yes.
love your enemies, which includes those that are harming all beings, and just, love and also forgiveness. And I think that's an energy that Christianity has kind of brought to the world
Yes.
that is, I
Yes.
think, made a difference. Yeah. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah. So, okay. I think we could talk for a long time. It's such an interesting topic. And I love dwelling in this place of I don't know for sure, so I'm open, I'm open to these new ideas, and I love the idea of listening to your heart and not even absolutely needing scripture, because what is the heart of God? What is the heart of God in me? But I do want to give you the last chance to share whatever. I know you've got a new book, and share whatever else that you want to share before we close.
Yes, I've written a new book called Embracing Limits: A Radical and Necessary Approach to the Environmental Crisis, which says that we need simple living on a massive scale, and we also need plant-based diets, vegetarianism, veganism on a massive scale to save the planet. Humans have overrun the planet. It's not like even it was 100 years ago, much less 1,000 years ago. That that and we've caused all kinds of problems, including climate change, uh, desertification, soil erosion, groundwater depletion, peak oil, resource depletion more generally. We're exploiting every last single square inch of the planet for our own narrow purposes. And I think that people look at my books on Christianity, and they look at this book about the environment and says, "Wow, he's talking about two completely different things." It's actually not completely two different things, because what we need, I wouldn't put it this way. I don't put it this way in my book. What we need is something like what Jesus was saying on a massive scale. That if you actually followed Jesus, you would live a more simple lifestyle, and eat vegetarian and all of these other things, and give to the poor. You wouldn't be greedy. All of these other things would save the planet. I think Thich Nhat Hanh had a saying. He says, individual awakening is not enough. We need a collective awakening. So that's what I think we need, is some sort of collective awakening, like the highest teachings of Christianity, and also like the highest teachings of Buddhism and other religions as well. That all these religions are sort of converging on the need for our behavior to align more with what Christians would say is God's purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just want to add also that war. I mean, underneath
For
war
example,
is
yeah,
a violent. Yeah, it is normalized violence underneath the idea of war. In addition to the banks and corporations benefiting, but is we accept it because we accept normalized violence, and we accept normalized violence on our plate every day, on our clothes, our entertainment, all of that with the animals, and people just can't really see that as long as you normalize violence anywhere, as long as violence anywhere is normalized, it's going to be normalized on a large scale, and we're in the middle of two big wars and all of that. So that's another thing that would be, realigning with the teachings of Jesus and early Christianity is to also come back to I prefer mercy about sacrifice and to
yes,
love one
yes,
another. Yeah.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Keith, this has been really great talking with you. I know you were a speaker the first time, my first retreat in 2021, you were remote because it was kind of a year where some came in person and others were remote. And I think you're such a unique scholar and have really looked at topics that others have not looked at. And so I would recommend your books and also maybe to see Christspiracy, and thank you so much for being a guest on the Spiritual Forum podcast today.
It's been a pleasure being here and talking with you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and we'll have links to all your stuff in the show notes. So thank you, everybody, for listening. And I now close the Spiritual Forum.